Raise your hand if you can see me. And stop talking. Raise your hand if you can see me and stop talking. That works. That works. If you can have a seat, if you're not seated already. You're supposed to be seated at the table that's on your name tag. Some people are nodding. I'm Peter Levine. I'm the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at Tisch College at Tufts University. I'm welcoming you to Frontiers of Democracy. Just to get a sense of who's in the room, raise your hand if you're coming here from overseas. And that might not mean just yesterday, but you feel like you're coming from another country. Raise your hand high. Great. Raise your hand if you are coming from outside of Massachusetts. Yeah. Yeah. So welcome to the Commonwealth from the few of us who are from here. That means almost all of you are going to raise your hand when I say welcome to Boston. So if you're not from Boston, raise your hand. You get to raise your hand. Right. Welcome to Boston. Welcome to Boston's Chinatown, where our building is intrusively located in Chinatown. Took a piece of Chinatown from the community, but we do work now as at least somewhat better on relations with that community, which is a historically Chinese American and also Syrian American community going back, the oldest Chinese community in the United States. And of course, before that, home to the Massachusetts people who were here first. So welcome to this community. Welcome to Tufts University. You're in the Tufts University Medical School. We also have a leafy, bucolic, liberal arts style campus about 6 miles away in Medford. You should come visit us. But here's our downtown campus. Welcome. Welcome to Tisch College, the Tisch College of Civic Life, which is the host. And welcome to the Frontiers of Democracy Conference. I've been sort of standing up here for 11 years. Conference has changed its form a little, may have changed its name, but I seem to remember that it was always called Frontiers of Democracy. I haven't saved these remarks from past years, but because they're surely not worth saving. But I have the feeling that if you looked back on them, you would see that I probably oscillated between two kind of moods or themes. So sometimes my remarks have been about the expanding frontiers of democracy because of inspiring movements, let's say in the Middle East or right here at home, or originally because of the election of a certain young American president who had lots of links to democracy movements. We had a chance to push back the frontiers of democracy, and that's why we picked the name in the first place. I think at other times, I've been talking more about the threatened frontier of democracy because of authoritarian regimes and movements around the world, or closer to home, or frightening technological or economic developments, or for other reasons, maybe we need to stand at the frontiers of democracy and block its opponents and say, no pasaran, we stop here. This year, I'll try to spare you both cliches, although I guess I just gave you both cliches. After all, who knows whether the frontiers are expanding or will expand or contract around the globe in the short term. Maybe in the long term, surely they will expand, but in the short term, who knows? Both, surely. As always, the frontiers are really fluid, contested, mobile, global. And as always, what happens ultimately depends upon people like us, a lot of other people besides us, but people like us, on how we think and work together. So let's get to work at the frontiers of democracy. I'm going to ask you another few questions to get a sense of who's here. Raise your hand if you're speaking in any form over the next, so lots of people. The distinction between speakers and everybody else is to be minimized. We're all speakers, but thank you for offering what you're offering. Raise your hand if you've been to the Frontiers of Democracy conference before. Okay, nice mix, I think, of veterans and newbies. More newbies, which is good. Raise your hand if you're one of my colleagues who works or studies at Tufts University. Right, so a few of us, but this is a national conference. Raise your hand if you're basically here because you found out about Frontiers. Maybe you already knew about it from the past. And you just signed up. You either purchased a ticket or you proposed a session and then purchased a ticket. But anyway, you came here on your own. Okay, great. So you are a critical part of this conference, that group. But I think you all realize by now that this conference has evolved so that it now also has the form that it's drawing in a number of groups that are kind of organized and that are gathering here. In some cases, you know the other members of the groups. In some cases, you actually don't because you're just going to be meeting them. So raise your hand if you're a member of the Bridge Alliance and have just been at the Bridge Alliance meeting. So I'm sure you will hear more about the Bridge Alliance, but and I'm afraid I'll mess up the tagline, Evelyn. But a wonderful coalition of non-profit and nonpartisan organizations working to heal American democracy. So likely NGO leaders and activists. Raise your hand if you're involved with the Cities of Service Network and you've been here for that group. So that's about, in total, about 14, 15 representatives of American cities who are working to engage their communities with city government. Raise your hand if you've arrived to begin the 2019 Summer Institute of Civic Studies. All right, so those people are in for a week of intensive conversations, about 1,500 pages of reading, talking about theory. They're just, they can't wait. And they don't know each other. They just have, they're just showing up. Raise your hand if you've done one of those Summer Institutes of Civic Studies before. Right, the alumni. See, you can survive. There were hundreds more who've done it and they couldn't get here. Raise your hand if you're part of the American Political Science Association's first annual Institute of Civically Engaged Research, as either a participant or in any way. Yeah, thank you. So that's just concluding, and that was an intensive 1 week discussion of how to be an engaged political scientist, and which we did here at Tufts. And so those folks do know each other after a week, but they're here. So all these categories are welcome and important. All are equally welcome and important, definitely including those who showed up by yourself. So if you don't feel like you're in a group, that you're also supposed to be here. You're part of it. But a principle of the design of this is to mix these different groups in different configurations so that we can build networks and connections, create dialogue opportunities for learning from quite different groups. So we spent a fair amount of time in this room at these curated tables. Right now you are seated so that there shouldn't be more than one person, well, maybe two, depending on the group, one or two people from each category that I mentioned before at your table. So maximum, so there basically should be political scientist or two, a city official or two, nonprofit leader or two, educator or two. Tomorrow morning you'll be seated in your categories again, which is a chance to kind of talk in that way and think about this conference together. It's a chance for the new Summer Institute people to meet each other. Every time you'll be seated with different people. So to be perfectly honest, by Saturday morning it's random, but it's still, but randomness works too. We also have concurrent sessions, which are displayed on the sign out there. They're on the website. You get to pick which ones to go to. The room numbers are there. I mean, the only thing is if the room is jammed, that means that one was oversubscribed, so please go somewhere else. Reassign yourself. The other format we have is this format we call short takes. And we've been doing it for 10 years or 11 years. We have hyper minimal intros for each of them. I do have a piece of paper here with some introductions, but they're super quick. These are very accomplished and distinguished people. They deserve long introductions. None of them are getting the introductions they deserve. They're also following in the footsteps of many other distinguished and wonderful people who didn't get the introductions they deserved. But it's intentional. It's to put the attention on the content and not the speakers. It's to try to minimize the distinction between the so-called speakers and everybody else, because you are going to be speaking, so you're also speakers. For the same reason, we don't have any Q&A time, because we don't want to have this sort of one-on-one between the speaker and you. Instead, the speakers have name assignments, table assignments, and so they'll come and sit with you, and I'll give you instructions for how to have that conversation when they're done. So I'm going to introduce everybody. I'm going to introduce them along with Robert Lieberman. Rob, so you know you're first up. So he's not on the program in the same way, but I decided we just for smoothness, we'll just treat you like a short take speaker. So I'm just going to do these quick intros, and then each person's going to speak, and they get 10 minutes max, and they're all ready to talk. And you should be thinking, just to foreshadow this a little, you should be thinking of synergies, of serendipitous connections between the talks. These are not it's not a panel. They're meant to be quite different. Omissions, things that none of them talked about. Why didn't anybody talk about this? Problems that one person created, set up or described that another person has a solution to. Problems that somebody set up that nobody has a solution to. Those are the kinds of things you should be thinking about. So I told you these are going to be quick, but here we go. So Robert Lieberman is the Krieger Eisenhower Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University. He's the author of highly influential and valuable books and articles, mostly on race and American politics. But the other thing that is key to Robert's participation here is that he's head of a task force of the American Political Science Association, which created the Institute for Civically Engaged Research, and we're hoping he'll talk a little about that, as well as about democracy, broadly defined. Dr. Jarvis Hall is a political science professor at North Carolina Central University in Durham, North Carolina, scholar of American politics, social movements, grassroots politics, civil rights, and other topics, but also, I said but also, but I meant and also, a major civic leader in North Carolina, serving on many of the key boards and networks for the civil society in the state of North Carolina, and has been involved with the Tomorrow Monday social movement in North Carolina, which is what he's going to be talking about. Maya Pace, where's Maya? She's here. Happens to be a recent graduate of Tufts University, and we couldn't be more proud of her. And that's where I first know her. But that's not why she's here. She's here to talk to us about an amazing startup organization called Lead for America that she's a co-founder of and co-leader of, and it's very remarkable. And her talk is called Start Where You Live. Jamila Michener is over there. She's a professor at Cornell University. Her recent and acclaimed and influential and admired book is Fragmented Democracy, Medicaid, Federalism, and Unequal Politics. And she studies how social welfare programs affect the political engagement of the people who participate in them. She'll be talking about health equity and democracy tonight. Wendy Willis directs the Deliberative Democracy Consortium and is also, and works at Portland State University, is also an accomplished, seriously published, respected poet. Her latest book is These Are Strange Times, My Dear, Field Notes from the Republic. And her title for tonight is What's Creed Got to Do with It, A Meditation. And then Andi Crawford is the Director of Empowerment and Citizen Engagement for the city of Lansing, Michigan. She's in the Cities of Service program, or network, which a lot of people here are in. And they have a program called Love Your Block. So she'll talk about Love Your Block in Lansing and about #LoveLansing. So, Robert, come on up.
Well, here, I'm going to put this here and stand here. All right, thanks. Thanks, Peter, for that overview of what is going to happen over the next couple of days. So I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm here largely on behalf of, as Peter mentioned, the American Political Science Association and our president, Roger Smith, of the University of Pennsylvania, who regrets that he couldn't be here. So I want to do a couple of things. I want to talk a little bit about democracy. And then I want to talk about some of the work that this task force that has been doing that I think are really pertinent to many of us in the room who are our political scientists and our connections with those of you who in the room who are not political scientists. So to pick up on one of Peter's the cliches that Peter didn't talk about, it may have escaped your notice, or it may not have escaped your notice, that democracy is not really in great shape these days. Democratic institutions and practices, of course, are under threat around the world, in Hungary and Turkey and Brazil, in the UK, and even here in the United States. In some work that I'm doing right now with my colleague Suzanne Mettler of Cornell University, the United States today is, in the big picture, in the middle of a really dangerous and I think potentially toxic mix of conditions that we know from the study of American history and the study of the fortunes of democracy in other countries are dangerous to democracy. Another colleague that we've done some work with who studies democracy elsewhere said to us in a conversation, yeah, democracies come and which to people who think about the United States for a living is kind of chilling. But the conditions that we worry about when we look at democracy around the world are, among other things, extreme polarization or tribalism in politics, racism or racial antagonism or nativism, or conflict over civic status, conflict over who is included in the democratic polity and we the people. Third, high and rising income inequality, and fourth, excessive executive power. These conditions come and go over time, and they've long been part of American history. And they've combined before in different ways to threaten democracy in really sometimes kind of chilling ways. In the 1790s, in the 1850s, in the run-up to the Civil War, in the 1890s as Reconstruction fell apart and we went through a severe period of de-democratization, removing voting rights from more than nearly 4 million people. The 1930s, the Depression was we don't often think of it this way, but this was a moment when democracy in the United States and around the world was understood to be under threat. And the 1970s and the Watergate crisis, which has been on a lot of people's minds lately, among others. Again today, this combination of conditions threatens to undermine whatever progress and stability American democracy may have achieved. And I think one of the great mistakes that Americans make often when we think about our own circumstances is to assume that this sort of institutional machine, the checks and balances, the separation of powers, the constitutional order, will automatically right itself like it's some kind of homeostatic system. I think the lesson of history and the lesson of other countries is that that doesn't happen automatically. How do we get out of this? As I suggested, this is not automatic. This is not like a homeostatic system or a sort of a Swiss watch, a machine made of intricate gears that as long as they're meshing properly will just run. Rather, people have to do stuff to maintain democracy. People have to play their constitutionally or institutionally or socially prescribed roles. People have to challenge bad things that happen. People have to challenge mistakes. People have to challenge diversions from the democratic path. There's a great story about Benjamin Franklin at the end of the Constitutional Convention. He's walking the streets of Philadelphia, and a woman stops him and says, "Dr. Franklin, what kind of, and we know you were working on a new government for the colonies in Independence Hall. What kind of government do we have?" And Franklin looks at her and says, "Madam, a republic, if you can keep it." And I think there's a lesson in that little story, whether it's one of those stories, it doesn't really matter whether it's true or not. Suzanne and I have a book coming out on this next year. And if you want to know more, you'll have to buy it and find out. All of this is a roundabout and somewhat self-serving way of saying, we don't really know what the answer is to how we get ourselves out of the challenge. But it's not a new challenge. It's a challenge that the United States has faced before, and I'm intermittently confident that we'll weather it with a lot of hard work from the people in this room and others, and intermittently confident and despairing, depending on the day, the hour, or whether I've read the news or not. Another feature of the contemporary crisis of polarization, and I want to use this to pivot to the other thing I want to talk about, is that this is all happening in the context of extreme skepticism, growing skepticism of science, of knowledge, of expertise. In general, the assault on the very ideas of truth, of facts, of the disinterested understanding of how the world works as a basis for observing, discerning problems and solving them. That is the very foundation of what those of us who are political scientists and in the academic world take as the sort of basis of our professional lives. The commitment to science, to knowledge, to systematic understanding. And if you work in a university, it's a particularly chilling time to be observing the progress or not lack of progress of democracy in the United States. It's in the face of this sort of combination of challenges that Roger Smith of Penn, the president of the American Political Science Association, appointed this task force on new partnerships of which Peter is a very valued member, along with Janet Kirkpatrick, who's also here. I think that's it from the task force here right now. And we were tasked with thinking about whether political science was living up to its promise as a discipline dedicated not only to the sort of careful and factual and dispassionate analysis of politics, but also whether our discipline was truly taking advantage of the opportunity to advance the cause of democracy, whether we're sufficiently engaged as an academic discipline at the frontiers of democracy. In a lot of ways, I like to think we're returning to the roots of political science, like the other American social sciences. We emerged in the late 19th and early 20th century, essentially as the research and development arm of the burgeoning sort of progressive reform movement, which sought to mobilize knowledge and data and expertise on behalf of social and political reform. And I think a spoiler alert here is we're not quite living up to this promise. For all of our expertise and for all of the extraordinary work that my colleagues do, political scientists are missing opportunities all over the place to learn from and engage with people and organizations who, first of all, already know more than we ever will about how politics and society work or don't work, and are trying to do something about it, to enhance democracy, to tackle challenges of inequality and exclusion, to improve lives and communities and nations around the world. Very briefly, the task force was charged with recommending concrete steps that we could take to deepen and broaden that engagement, and the way we've chosen to do this is through a series of partnerships across different kinds of academic institutions, across ideological lines, and most pertinently for this group and this weekend, I think, between those in the academy and those in what we typically and sometimes derisively call the real world. And we've launched a number of initiatives in the areas of teaching, research, and civic engagement. I'll just mention two very quickly before Peter pushes me off stage. One is the Institute for Civically Engaged Research, which just concluded, and most of the participants are here, and I hope you'll get a chance to hear from some of them about the great work that they did. This was a group of political scientists coming together to really think intensively for a week about how to do research in critical engagement with civic organizations and with communities. And we'll be launching, we the association will be launching this coming year, a new award, association-wide award for political scientists engaged in civically engaged research, because we think that it's critically important that as an academic discipline, we promote this kind of work and this kind of partnerships that are represented around this room. So I'm thrilled to be here and to learn more about a lot of the tremendous work that all of you are doing. Thanks very much.
Jarvis.
Yeah, we were just going through instructions. Good evening. Thank you, Peter, for the invitation to participate in Frontiers of Democracy. I'm really excited to be here, and I've also vowed that Peter would not be giving me the hook to get me away from the mic. So I'm going to go through this very quickly, and I'll be around for a while. So if you have any questions, just let me know. Moral Monday, spoiler alert, I'm using that term also, was the most significant example of grassroots mobilization to take place in several decades within the United States. That's it. Okay, I'm done. All right? Okay. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen by accident. It didn't just happen. It happened because of a number of things that took place prior to Moral Mondays that we saw emerge in 2013. So quickly, the most important thing was the charismatic leadership of Reverend William Barber. How many of you have heard of Reverend William Barber? Okay, that's what I thought. So it all started when he was elected president of the North Carolina NAACP in 2006. He was a convener of, now, this is the quiz for the folk who heard part of my presentation yesterday, HK on J. What does HK on J stand for? Folk from the Engaged Research? Historic Thousands on Jones Street. that was an effort to mobilize grassroots people to go to Jones Street, which is where the legislature is in North Carolina, to advocate for a progressive 14-point policy agenda, which I will show in a minute. But he organized that, then more Mondays, and now, of course, he's doing the Poor People's Campaign that was successful in bringing 9 presidential candidates to their convention just in the past few days to talk about what they're going to do in terms of economic justice issues, and that was pretty amazing. Historic thousands on Jones Street because that's the location of the North Carolina General Assembly, the legislature. That's the thousands. We started out with 50K on J. We said, let's sort of tone it down a little bit. And we had about 5,000 when we first launched HK on J. However, in 2016, we did have approximately 80,000 people to participate in this march that takes place the second Saturday in February of every year. Yes, it's cold, even in North Carolina there. Okay? But anyway, this is the 14-point agenda. I can't go through everything, but you see what I said yesterday, the usual suspects: education, a livable wage, health care, civil rights, election reform, lift every HBCU, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the 14-point agenda. And it pulled together organizations into a coalition, and that's what's so important here. It was a very diverse coalition that was pulled together to support this 14-point agenda. Political education, we went through every point and we talked about how it impacted the people of North Carolina. I'm not going to read all of this, but we tried to educate the people about why this 14-point agenda was so important. And we actually assembled them into an auditorium. As I said, we had about 5,000 people there for the first one, and they actually took a vote, and they voted on it. Now, not surprisingly, because they came, they voted yes. I don't think there were any no votes, but we could say that those people assembled actually voted for this 14-point progressive agenda. And they actually signed it. They actually put the agenda on a scroll, and the building you see in the back there is the General Assembly. So literally, the agenda was presented to the General Assembly. Okay, the agenda was presented to the General Assembly. Now, I don't know where that scroll is now. It used to be on our campus, but I'm not quite sure where that scroll is. But over time, more people would sign it over and over again, okay? So I've done some surveys over time, and when I've asked people what are the important issues, not surprising, education would be one of the most important issues, healthcare, livable wages. Education is important because for most states, the most important thing that state governments do is what? Education. In North Carolina, over half of the budget goes to education, so that's not surprising. But you see the distribution for the other issues. Just some information about those who participated in HK on J, at least in 2009, when this particular survey actually took place. More females than males. Participants were relatively young. Around 63% were 40 years old or younger, and nearly half were 30 years or younger. African Americans made up about half of the participants, with whites making up nearly 40%. Religion was very important. 83% of the participants identified with a religious affiliation. Almost half were Protestants. There was some religious diversity, however, because we had a number who identified as Catholics, Muslims, Buddhists, and non-religious also. Party identification, not surprisingly, 80% of the participants identified in some way with the Democratic Party. 55% identified with some degree, as some degree of liberal and progressive. So that wasn't surprising either. But we did have a number of folk who self-identified as conservative, very conservative, in fact. Just a handful, though. But the assembly, the march itself, which takes place which takes place again every February, is always followed by a lobbying day. It's called the People of Color Lobbying Day. And in this particular year, for this flyer, it was in March, where some of the people who actually participated in HKOJ for that year will actually go to the legislature to lobby their legislators about the 14-point agenda. Now, one year, the Speaker of the House, I'm not going to say who it was at that time, was seen leaving the legislative building as people were coming in there because he didn't want, apparently, he did not want to talk to grassroots citizen activists, or at least that's what we said anyway. Public policy, what did HKOJ do? There were some successes. The Racial Justice Act, again, I'm not going to read this. You can look up the Racial Justice Act in North Carolina to see what it did. It was groundbreaking, I think, at the time. Forced sterilizations that had taken place in North Carolina, children's health care, et cetera. So there were some policy successes that we attribute directly to the mobilization of grassroots people. But after HKOJ, I argue that Moral Mondays would not have been able to happen without a couple of other intervening campaigns. One was the Wake County School Board was taken over by a Tea Party supported majority. They made a major change in the diversity policy that they had. That was very successful. That was a model for school integration around the country. But the most important thing about this was the decision by Reverend Barber and other folk that were part of the coalition to engage in civil disobedience. That was a major step, okay? Also, we did a poverty tour around the state of North Carolina. This was not Cornell West or what's his name? Who? No, not Michael Eric Dyson, but other. But anyway, this was North Carolina. The reason I point this out is that this is where the Poor People's Movement really came from. Was a direct result of the poverty tour where we went around the state to not talk to people about poverty, but to listen to people about the kinds of things and experiences that they had as they struggled to make ends meet. And Amendment 1. Amendment 1 in North Carolina, which was on the ballot in 2012, was banning same-sex marriage. Reverend Barber came out in opposition to this amendment. It did pass overwhelmingly in North Carolina, not surprising. And of course, they put it on the ballot during the primary because they knew more Republicans would be mobilized during the primary because this was in 2012. On the Democratic side, in terms of the presidential election, who was going to be the nominee on the Democratic side? Barack Obama. Everybody knew that, right? But on the Republican side, it was contested. So in other words, the Republican Party was more mobilized and more likely to, I'm not going to let you do it to me, Peter. So Moral Mondays emerged as a direct result of these things. Republicans had a supermajority. They did a number of what were called extremist acts, especially with regard to the Earned Income Tax Credit, no Medicaid expansion. The coalition, again, said that they used Keynesian nonviolence process. If you read the letter from Birmingham jail, you know what I'm talking about here. Moral Mondays summary, and this is the important thing. There were 13 Moral Mondays in 2013 over 14 weeks. 12 included civil disobedience. As I said, that was the big step. The willingness to be arrested in order to bring attention. And over 930 people were arrested during the Moral Mondays. And it began to spread around the state of North Carolina, and it began to spread around the country. Some of you may have some Moral Mondays movements in your state going on now. If you don't, you need to start one. Thank you.
Maya, you're up.
Hi, everyone. It's really, really wonderful to be here and just so inspired and energized from what you just shared, Jarvis. Like, really humbled to be going after that amazing, amazing talk. But thank you all for listening to me for the next 10 minutes. So I'm going to ask you all to bear with me briefly and close your eyes. And if you could just picture a place that you call home. It might be a physical location. Perhaps it's a house, a town, a view from your favorite hike. Perhaps it's a person, the face of your beloved, a memory of someone who has passed. Perhaps you can hear something sizzling in the kitchen. Perhaps there's a dog barking. Perhaps you can hear the seagulls crying and the smell of musty seaweed rotting on the beach. Perhaps you feel a sense of nourishment and joy. Or maybe the feeling is a bit more complicated. Maybe there are histories that you'd rather not remember, parts of yourself that you no longer recognize. But maybe you also feel a sense of accountability, a sense of responsibility, a sense that something is at stake for you. Okay, you can open your eyes, thank you. So I wonder, for how many of you, when you think about some of the challenges that are facing democracy in our world today, think to that place or to those people? How many of you, when you think about what the future might look like, have that place or those people come to mind? I know for me, when I worry about the future, and when I think, where can I make change? That place, those people come to mind. So this is my home. I'm from Northern California. I kind of outed myself there when I mentioned seagulls and rotting seaweed. Please notice the Oreo cows are the most important part of this picture. And although I'm far from home, I can still feel that sense of love and nourishment from my community. But more importantly, they hold me to task. And they keep me asking, what more can I do? Because I want where I'm from to be a place that is equitable, that is just, that has a future that I want to be a part of. And so, as Peter mentioned, I am Chief Community Officer and one of the co-founders of Lead for America, where we are trying to build a public service movement and trying to institutionalize and make viable young people taking action on that craving and turning it into a career path. So our primary intervention point right now is a 2-year paid fellowship program for young folks to return to their hometowns and serve in local government positions. And we're actually about to start our month-long summer training institute in about 3 days in DC. So I'm gonna hop on a plane down to DC right after this amazing conference wraps up. And we want to, again, kind of make a norm out of taking action on this craving. We prioritize economically distressed rural, urban, and tribal communities, places where these young folks often hear, "Congrats, you made it out." And I want to interrogate that statement for a second within the context of what it means for our democracy. When I hear that statement, I think that it implies this place is not worthy of transformational leadership. This place is not worthy of reflective and representative leadership. What does it mean for our democracy that we are telling young leaders that only certain communities are worthy of them, are worthy of their leadership? What does it mean for our democracy that we are not all trying to build communities where young people can look around themselves and feel proud to be a part of them? And for our fellows, they are pushing back against that narrative, and they are trying to say, no, I'm going to lean in to the discomfort and complexity of home, and I'm going to take action where I'm from to make change. And I often get the question, is it hard to find fellows? And the answer is a wholehearted no. This first year, we had over 1,000 registered applicants on our application portal and over 700 applicants to apply to places to return home. Our fellows are going to 46 different communities in 19 different states. and they represent a pretty diverse cross-section of society. And I share these numbers not because I think that they're anything special about Lead for America, although I'm proud of our recruiting strategy. I think more it demonstrates the craving of young people to plug in, the craving of young people to take action on that love and care and accountability they feel to their hometowns. And so I want to say, perhaps in order to revitalize our democracy, perhaps one of the biggest frontiers of our democracy is actually to come home. And I mean that in two different ways. The first way is perhaps we need to come home to ourselves and see ourselves as radical agents of change. And the second is that we need to see our communities, each community, as part of a fully working democracy. And so I'm gonna throw this up on the board. This is our model of leadership that kind of underpins everything that we do. And we ask our fellows and we ask ourselves to practice this kind of two-pronged approach to homecoming. So this model of leadership asks that our fellows, who are going to hopefully catalyze a change across the nation that will center community well-being, we ask them to act at the intersection of foresight, which we define as historically informed, presently grounded, and conceptualized; justice, which is first and foremost rooted in love, seeks equity, and requires courage; service, for which you need to be proximate to the people and problems at hand. You need to act with cultural humility, and you need to empower others to be their own agents of change because they are the ones who know what they need most; and innovation, which requires curiosity, evidence, and generativity. And while it acts at those four intersections, it also requires that you not only are generating, but you're also interrogating yourself, and you're also entangled in your community. You're envisioning a possibility for the future that you want to be a part of, and you're taking action to make it that way. This convergence is a sort of homecoming. So I want to end today by saying that this act of coming home, I think, is one of democratic resilience. When we look around ourselves and we say, where can I begin? Where can I get to work? In my own community, that is an act that is also saying, I believe that these voices also deserve representation. I believe that this community has a place in our democracy, and I believe that this community can be a catalyst for change. Perhaps when we come home, we can change the world. Thank you all.
Did I mention that we are very proud of Maya?
Yes.
And that she has an amazing startup?
Mm-hmm.
Jamila, you're up.
Okay, I'm going to try to go quick. I'm going to shift gears a little. That was great, though. It is, I mean, each person that went, I thought, oh no, I should have gone first. Because who likes to follow the facts? And I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of my research that I think is relevant to the kind of theme of today's, or the conference, which is Frontiers of Democracy, and think about a different frontier, which is thinking about public policy, social policy as a frontier, a place where there are ongoings that are relevant to and matter for democracy. Yesterday, I met with some of the folks from ICER, from the Institute, and talked about different forms of engagement, and I mean, I think a lot of that was sort of tapped into previously, so at least I feel like that's been covered. Okay, so I'm gonna jump right in so I don't waste too much time. Somewhere toward the end of graduate school, as I was working on my dissertation, I hadn't, prior to that, really had much interest in health policy. I cared about what is reflected in everything that I do, all of my work, which is racially and economically marginalized communities and people, right? So I was spending a lot of time thinking about race and poverty and public policy, not specifically Medicaid and not specifically health policy. But what I was doing at that time was some qualitative work, some in-depth interviews. I was talking to people about how the state mattered in their lives. And people kept bringing up Medicaid, and I was actually actively trying to avoid it. I felt like it was a labyrinth, like it was really complicated, and I was gonna have to put too much work into figuring it out. And I was also worried about being siloed, like being thought of as a health person or a health policy person, and not sort of being viewed as broadly as I wanted to be as a scholar at that point. At the same time, I had and still have a commitment to my research reflecting people's actual core concerns in their lives. So it kept nagging at me that people were telling me about Medicaid, and I thought, okay, I probably have to think about this. Lucky enough, I was able to do a postdoc with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that provided me with 2 years really to do nothing except think about this. So I spent some time trying to understand how Medicaid matters to people, not just how it matters to them with respect to their health, right? We know that Medicaid allows predominantly low-income people, disproportionately people of color, to have access to health care when they otherwise would not have. And so there are all sorts of health effects. As a political scientist, I really wanted to understand what the implications of a policy like this were for democratic citizenship. Now, initially, I had the conversations that made me think that this was even a question worth asking were sort of interviews where I was not asking people about Medicaid. I was talking to them about other things that I had gone into those spaces thinking were important. And they would end up saying things like this to me. This is a woman who I initially talked to in Chicago. All of these names are fake names. They're not real people's names. But they are things that real people said to me. And I asked this woman, Mabel, about the American dream, which is random. The reason I asked her about that is because at the time I was doing these really open-ended qualitative interviews, and I didn't want to tell people too much. I wanted to ask them broad questions and let them tell me what mattered to them and sort of figure out what was going on in their lives. So I asked her about the American dream, and this is what she tells me. I won't read it for you, but it essentially says, you know, it's a nightmare. And she starts talking about having to go to the doctor, having to choose between, you know, medication and food. She talks about, you know, trying to enroll in Medicaid at one point and leaving eventually because it was so overwhelming to be a part of the program. And then eventually, because prior to this, I had been asking her about government and politics. You know, she's like, you're asking me about that, but I don't really know, right? And ultimately, she doesn't have too much to say about government and politics in a formal sense, but she has a lot to say about what she's able to get access to via social policy and what the experience of that is like. So after having several conversations like this, it became clear to me, okay, I need to pay attention to Medicaid, to social policy, and what it means for democratic citizenship. So I started to sit down and talk to more people about it. I do sort of multi-method work, so I do a lot of qualitative work, but also do quantitative work. And initially when I thought, okay, I think Medicaid matters politically, you know, I knew that there were a number of scholars who were doing work looking at the relationship between social policy and political participation. And I wanted to understand general patterns, and I found a survey called the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Survey, a survey where over 50% of the people surveyed, of about 9,000 people surveyed, were Medicaid beneficiaries. So I had a large sample of low-income people who relied on this policy. And initially, I just wanted to see, does it look like there's a relationship? And what I found was that you could see the dark bars, those are Medicaid beneficiaries, and the light bars are people who are also low income, right, and economically marginal, but who are not Medicaid beneficiaries. And it looked like there was a difference. It looked like beneficiaries were less likely to participate in politics based on this large, you know, sort of quantitative survey. And I did all sorts of finagling, statistical finagling that I will not bore us with because it's too late in the evening for that, to try to see if this was really about something else, if it was really about poverty, if it was really about the neighborhood you lived in, or any of the other things that we know that ways that Medicaid beneficiaries might be different than everyone else. And I couldn't make this effect go away. No matter, there was nothing else that I could, that could explain it. So then I started to really talk to people. I wanted to understand this. One of the things when I first started showing just the quantitative results that people would say to me is, does this mean Medicaid's bad for democracy? You know, oh no. You know, the conservatives, they're gonna love this. They're gonna say on top of all the other ways that you know, government largesse is making poor people bad, it's also making them bad citizens. And my answer to that was always pretty straightforward. No, that's not what this is about. But I needed to know what it was about, so I started to talk to more and more people. One of the people who sort of I opened my book with and who emerges a lot in my research, who I'll use as an example today, but she's just reflective of broader patterns that came up, is a woman named Terry. I met Terry in Georgia, and I met her outside of a social services agency. I asked her if she had Medicaid, if she'd be willing to talk to me about it. She said, yeah. We met the next day at like a burger joint that she recommended. She was just really happy that I was gonna buy her lunch and give her a $25 gift card. And she came really prepared. She had spent the day before remembering that there was someone tomorrow that wanted to talk to her about Medicaid. She was ready to hit the ground running. And so I sat down and just said to her, tell me about yourself. And this was the first thing she told me. She talked about living in different states and going from place to place and realizing that Medicaid was really different in different places. And she talked about what a whirlwind that had been for her, right? She started to tell me specific things about specific places. Ohio's the easiest. They really care. That kind of surprised me. I don't know if anyone's here from Ohio, but whatever stereotype I have about Ohio, that did not comport with it. But then she said, you know, California is fast, but there's so many people, right? It's out of control. It's really rapid. And Georgia, she talked about how they limit everything. You can only go to this doctor on this day in this county and get this benefit, right? There's another woman who I talked to in Georgia who said, you know, when her daughter got her tonsils taken out, they would only give her so much ice in the hospital, right? Like literally you were limited in how much ice you could get. And when I continued to talk to Terry, she continued to tell me more and more about how geographic policy disparities in Medicaid were really, probably running out of time. Oh, okay, I'm good. Had really affected her life. So she told me about her grandmother, for example, who had come from Chicago to visit her in Georgia. And they couldn't get her prescription medication because the Medicaid agency in Georgia was not going to recognize her grandmother's Medicaid from Illinois, right? And she was really torn up telling me about this part, about how they were scrambling to find $190 so that her grandmother wouldn't be in pain, right? And then she says toward the end of this part of our conversation, it was amazing, and it's for something provided by the government. You're limiting the use of something that's supposed to make people better. As we continued our conversation, it became more and more clear to me that she thought about this in political terms, right? So if it was about helping people, you'd say, yeah, let my state be more productive and healthy so that we don't have people losing their lives so they can be productive citizens, right? And when I asked her at some point, like, well, okay, you see the political valence to this, you understand it's the state, it's the government, would you do anything about it? Do you think other people, other Medicaid beneficiaries would do anything about it? And she said white noise. I didn't know what that meant, so I just was quiet for a while, and then I said, okay, explain that to me. She said white noise is that people choose to say, well, if they give it to me, they give it to me. If they don't, they don't. White noise means you feel like in your world you have no say. No say in the process if you don't agree with what's going on with Medicaid. It's the meaning, the process. I've never really seen anybody stand up, and I don't know why we don't fight. You know, this is one example of a conversation that I had, but I had many interviews that essentially went like this. And one of the things that really emerged for me that I hadn't gone into this process thinking about was the relevance of federalism, the relevance of the fact that people get very different things in different places, and crucially that they know it. They know it because they move, they know it because they have family members and friends in other places, they know it from watching the news, they know it from their experiences and from their proximate experiences. And they interpret it as meaning something. It says something about my relationship to the government, about my status and place and role. I'm almost done, I promise. So one of the things I did was I went back to the data to see, are there state level differences in the relationship between Medicaid and political participation, that negative relationship I had identified before? And what I found that was in some states like New York, California, Virginia, perhaps not usual suspects, there was a really negative relationship. Medicaid, being a Medicaid beneficiary was making it less likely that you would participate. In plenty of states that didn't exist, in some states there was a positive relationship. Now, part of what I do in my book is I tease this out and I try to think through what explains this, what the specific policy factors are that explain this. One of the things that I find over and over again is that in places that are reducing benefits, that are giving people less, there are also corresponding reductions in political engagement and in participation in democratic political behavior, right? So I'll end here, And I'll say the real point is that health policy matters for democracy. And it's easy to overlook social policy as a frontier of democracy, but it really is.
Thanks, Peter. And it's so great to be here with all of you. I feel very inspired already. I've made a lot of notes about what I need to think about, like Moral Mondays when I get home. So yesterday was my birthday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. Though I know it's undignified to admit it in such an impressive and serious gathering, I love birthdays. First of all, of course, there's cake. And who doesn't love cake? But secondly, we Americans have become such workaday creatures that we don't get to celebrate, let alone ceremonialize that much anymore. We can answer our email and grocery shop and pay our gas bill anytime and anywhere. One day bleeds into the next. It is as if, as we Catholics call it, all time is ordinary time. But birthdays give us a chance to slip out of ordinary time and reflect, a chance to assess the old year, to plan for the new one, to reconnect with our values and how we want to live them out. And yet, as much as I love birthdays and the few other blowout celebrations we allow ourselves, graduations, weddings, even funerals, they mark individual milestones, and the aspirations they prompt us to reflect on are also individual. Don't get me wrong, these reflections, these values and goals and aspirations can and often do involve other people, as in, I love my mother. I value my relationship with my mother. And therefore, this year, I resolve to be more patient with my mother. All good. But both the values, my love for my mother, and the goal to be more patient with her are entirely within my control. My mother has no say in the matter. To be clear, the implementation is not always within my control because things happen to interfere with the execution of the plan. Maybe my mother will stop talking to me, taking away my opportunity to be more patient with her. But the intention is always mine. So that leads to the question I'd like to ponder with you here tonight and for the rest of the weekend. What are our shared values and aspirations? Do we have any shared values and aspirations? How do we discern them? How do we announce them? How do we attend to them in the face of pluralism and inequities and structural oppressions? What, in the face of all that, is our shared creed? What, in the face of all that, can be our shared creed? So here I'm going to digress for a moment. Many of you in the room are scholars and academics who I'm intimidated by. But I, on the other hand, am not. But I do teach poetry. And by that I mean I teach students who want to write poems. Most of my students are well into adulthood. If they're going to go to college, they've already done so. But they, for whatever beautiful and unfathomable reason, love poems. And they want to get better at writing them. But I will tell you this, the students who struggle the most with writing poems are those who have seriously studied literature in college or graduate school. It's not that they struggle intellectually exactly, but they struggle emotionally. There are many reasons for it: intimidation, fear that they can't live up to their own high standards. But the biggest, most immobilizing reason that they struggle and flail is that they have become adept at critique. That critical theory has lodged itself in their experience of the world and in their experience of language. They have become expert at giving words the side eye, at reducing words to the power relationships between writer and reader, between speaker and hearer. They have become ruthlessly skilled at shredding an argument, a poem, a novel, a speech, a tweet, sometimes before it even hits the page or the airwaves. And boy, is this a seductive way of looking at the world. I know, I've been there, because once you get good at it, deconstructing everything, you read and hear, you are relieved of the almost unbearable burden of confusion and uncertainty. You are relieved of the burden of having to name what you care about and embrace meaning. But here's the downside. Once you get really good at deconstruction, it's hard to write a poem. My smartest, most educated, most literate students spend a lot of time casting about and suffering when it comes time to actually write something. And that is because poems, actually making poems, requires something different of them. Making poems requires a dramatization of what does matter to them, of what does break their heart, of what does confuse and perplex them and keep them up at night. Making poems requires them to reveal themselves, to declare themselves. And it's really hard to do that when you know that a deconstructionist, whether it's yourself or someone else, is lying in the weeds, ready to tear you and your brand new poem apart. That, I realized, was a long digression into poetry. And I know that it ends where I started, on our ability and willingness to declare our own intentions. But the dilemma is worth re-examining because it's hard. It's hard to raise up our heads out of our little burrows and say out loud or in writing, this is who I am, this is what I believe, this is what I intend. It's hard to declare our values and intentions because even if we're not attacked for them, once we've stated them, we have to hold ourselves accountable for them. And I return to the question of declaring our own values because what we are asking of ourselves in a pluralistic democracy is even harder, much harder actually. Because like my poets, and I accept people in this room, because like my poets, we have become better at declaring what we are against than what we are for. But in a pluralistic democracy, we have to ask ourselves to sign on to a set of values and aspirations, to a creed that we did not entirely generate ourselves. We are asking ourselves not only to be makers, like my poets, but also to be joiners. We are asking ourselves to declare our intentions and pitch our worldview and our way of life to people we don't know, we probably don't like, and we suspect don't have our best interests at heart. Given what our political culture looks like at the moment, that seems like almost a ridiculous proposition. It seems like a dangerous proposition. It seems like a self-destructive proposition. But, and here I ask this sincerely, what are our alternatives? Because while I most certainly don't want to peek out of my rabbit hole to offer my dearest values to people I suspect are craven or bigoted or corrupt, I also don't want to live in a world, or have my children live in a world, where this is as good as it gets. I don't want to just throw up my hands and say, well, that's it. We can't come together to tackle racial injustice or radical income inequality or climate catastrophe because I need to protect my own neck, because I'm too invested in the fight, because I'm not willing to try to find a way that we, at least a slim majority of us, might put some shared ideals out there that we can defend even in the face of the haters. For those of us who are Americans in the room, and I apologize to those who are not because I know this thinking is seriously rooted in Americanness, we are about to hear a whole bunch of presidential candidates tell us that the United States is exceptional because it is a nation of ideas. But what are those ideas? And who do they belong to? What does the affirmation of a renewed American or German or Nigerian or Costa Rican creed look like? Do we reaffirm the values we've inherited in the Constitution, in the Declaration of Independence, or their equivalents in your own countries? Do we scrap it all and start over? And if we were to do that, how would we do it? None of us alone can have the answers. But as Ta-Nehisi Coates said earlier this week in his congressional testimony in favor of reparations, many of us would love to be taxed for the things we are solely and individually responsible for. But we are American citizens, and thus bound to a collective enterprise that extends beyond our individual and personal reach. So it's incumbent on us to try to figure it out together. And maybe over the next couple of days, we can turn our intentions toward one another. Maybe we can call one another close enough to be vulnerable and creative and speculative. Maybe we can invite one another to be makers and joiners. And at the heart of all this, of course, is a sleight of hand. Woven into the fabric of this talk are the threads of my own values, the strands, oops, I'm almost done here, of my own aspirations. So let me state a couple of those values outright. I do believe in words. I think they're alchemical, I think they're magical, I think words can help conjure what we imagine into being. I think they offer spaces of connection and communion in addition to the rending power of bare-knuckled conflict and division. I believe that skillfully and empathetically wielded, words can make us better, more moral, more imaginative, more alive. And I believe that we are all in this together. I believe that my well-being is entwined with your well-being. And I don't think that my values matter that much if they don't consider your fate and your dignity and the miracle of us all being right here together, right now. And you know what else? I think we need to use words, like we have tonight, our most aspirational and imaginative words, to come closer to one another rather than further apart. I think when we encounter one another, we need to lead with fierce affection, one that doesn't suffer fools or injustice gladly, but an affection that is shot through with the faith that we can look out for one another. And though it is hard, I do believe that it is possible for us, we the people of goodwill and fierce affection, to declare ourselves to a waiting world.
Andi, where are you? Here you are.
I'm a super short take.
No.
See? Short take. That's what I thought it meant when you extended the invitation to me. Is it okay if I just pull the laptop down? Yeah. Is that okay? Ah, there you are. Perfect. Yeah. All right, thank you. Good evening. My name is Andi Crawford, and I serve actually as the Chief Innovation Officer and the Director of Neighborhoods and Citizen Engagement for the City of Lansing. I bring you greetings from the Honorable Mayor Andi Shore, and I'm thrilled to be here with you tonight. If you don't know Lansing, Michigan, we of course are the state capital. We are also a third-tier city in a Rust Belt state. We are also going to choose your next president.
Choose wisely.
So it is important to pay attention to us. That is true. If you would like to win the award for civically engaged research that was mentioned earlier, we'll help you do that in Lansing. Come on over. We have a real culture within our city's government of opening up to academics. Some of that is because we're about a half a mile from Michigan State University, but we also work closely with all kinds of folks. So we have a neighborhood work group in which we have academics that sit with us in our staff meetings, and they are listening specifically for friction points within our city government and helping us identify opportunities for us to change our processes. They are in our circle of trust, and they know they can get kicked out of that room very quickly should they do something that no one has ever come close to. But we are really grateful to have them. So we have a lot of scholars from Michigan State in all kinds of different fields. We also work closely with the University of Michigan, particularly their College of Information Science, a bunch of students that will go on to do user experience work in Silicon Valley, but they are spending some time with us in the public realm. We also host this summer a Harvard Summer Fellow, and we'll make anything up. So we'll make up a fellowship for you. It's no problem. Come on over. We'll make it up. And if you live on the East Coast, it's cheaper for you to be there for a whole summer than it is to be in your apartment here for a week. Just buy a house. It's fine. We'll help you. It's no problem. Come on over. So I grabbed this napkin on my way out of my hotel because I thought it would introduce a little bit of scandal to our evening, and that was important to me because that's where my notes are on. Hashtag LOVELansing. Love your block and love Lansing. We're going to talk for a long time in our session tomorrow about Love Your Block and all the great work that Cities of Service has helped us do in Lansing, Michigan. Hashtag LOVELansing is, that's just made up by our citizens, and you'll see if you take a little tour on social media of hashtag LOVELansing, it's just like this hug from the community to Lansing. And so Maya, your words struck with me because I did come home to make change in my own community. I'm a Lansing native, and I have done a lot of work around the country. And I skipped the recession in Michigan, and I was in South Florida, and I was working down there, and I was watching Gran Torino. I don't know if you guys know that movie, Gran Torino. It is not a glamorous look at the Midwest or cities like us, and I found myself, this is a true story, this is not in my notes to tell you this, for some reason it might be the wine, But I was just weeping on my couch watching Gran Torino and feeling so incredibly homesick, and felt like a fraud working in a community that wasn't mine when I was saying my community and our community. And so came home, and I'm thrilled to be working back home in Lansing. But in Lansing, we're a scrappy town full of blue-collar intellectuals, and we are, this hashtag Love Lansing has really emerged. And it really is just this hug. And so in my office, we do a whole lot of things. But one of the things we try to do is take that kind of virtual hug and turn it into actual real work in the field. So how do we not only invite the citizenry to do what they want to do anyway, but how do we actively facilitate it? How do we make things happen and say that we are partners in the work together, and that we actually have a lot of assets within the city that we can deploy with the help of an army of citizens who care a lot about where they live. And so we work on that all the time. How do we take that virtual hug and turn it into action? So what do we do? Like I said, we'll get into nuts and bolts tomorrow, but we can help design things. We have experts that can do things like the technical stuff when we work side by side with citizens on what they might want in their community. So we can bring those resources to bear. We can certainly open up our doors and let people sit in on meetings that typically take place in City Hall. We can turn City Hall inside out. And take it directly out into the community, which we talk about doing all the time. We can help ideas get generated and bring them to life. We can do all kinds of research and support, and we can execute alongside our citizenry. And our office really is focused on what we call the 3 C's. We can convene, we can serve as convener-in-chief. When the mayor calls a meeting, people show up. That actually is a really beneficial thing, so we can put that power to work in our community. So we can convene, we can capacity build, we can help organizations grow their own strength and capacity on the ground, and we can connect to resources. So that's the 3C model that we work on all the time. The great John Dingell is from Michigan, and he said, you don't have power, you hold power. And we think that is absolutely true. So how do you hold that? But like how you would hold a bird, right? So not like a stranglehold on power, but like this nice little hold that says, that power can be lightly held, but fiercely wielded when appropriate, and that we can do great things in our community together. So if you want to know more about that, come around tomorrow. That's my promo. Thanks, and have a great night.
Well, let's give the whole group of beautiful people. So, you know the rules. You should introduce yourselves to each other, of course, and then just find themes that you found resonant in those talks. Try to draw connections between them. Just to answer the question, what did they all talk about? What did none of them talk about? Did some of them answer other ones? Just talk about it. At 7:30, I'll let you know that at 7:30, which will be kind of a break where you can comfortably leave your table without feeling like you're abandoning them. You don't actually get kicked out. You can stay longer. At some point, we'll kick you out. This goes on for a while and then it ends. But take it away. And see you tomorrow morning.